The Grand Palace of the Varnek's dominion stood as a testament to unparalleled technological advancement. Its walls shimmered with an iridescent glow powered by an energy source centuries beyond human comprehension. Queen Zephyr, the ruler of this vast and emotionless empire, sat on her throne, her gaze fixed on the holographic map hovering before her. Despite the outward serenity, she exuded an invisible weight bore down on her, a longing she could neither name nor understand. Vexens her people ed themselves on their logical minds and disciplined lives. Emotion, as they saw it, was an evolutionary flaw, something primitive species clung to. Their culture valued efficiency and intellect above all else, leaving no room for the messiness of feelings. For thousands of years, this belief had sustained their civilization, but Zephyr often wondered if something crucial had been lost along the way. As she dismissed the council meeting, Zephyr lingered in the vast throne chamber. She looked at the ornate inscriptions etched into the walls, each symbol a reminder of Vex's rise to dominance, yet none of it filled the void within her. She activated a private console and opened a forbidden archive, one she had kept hidden even from her closest advisors. The holographic images that danced before her eyes were unlike anything she had ever encountered. These were records from a primitive planet called Earth, detailing the lives of its inhabitants. Zephyr was captivated by the stories of humans, how they fought, laughed, and loved with such intensity. One particular concept piqued her curiosity: the climax, a phenomenon described as the pinnacle of emotional and physical connection among the Vars. This was dismissed as a myth, a fabrication of lesser species, but Zephyr couldn't ignore the curiosity tugging at her. As she studied further, a name caught her attention: Orion Cade, a human diplomat who had recently arrived in the Varnek's dominion to negotiate an alliance. His profile described him as resourceful, adaptable, and intriguingly a storyteller. Zeph's interest deepened. Perhaps this human could provide answers to the questions that had long haunted her. Orion Cade disembarked from his sleek shuttle, stepping onto the gleaming landing platform of Zeph's palace. His sharp green eyes took in the alien grandeur, but his expression remained composed. Years of diplomacy had trained him to navigate the unknown with confidence, even if his surroundings screamed intimidation. Welcome, Orion Cade greeted Lith, Zeph's chief advisor, her voice devoid of warmth, but meticulously polite. The queen awaits your presence in the grand chamber. Orion nodded, following her through corridors lined with luminescent art. His every step echoed in the silence, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being closely observed. When he finally entered the throne room, his breath caught momentarily. Queen Zephyr was unlike anything he had imagined. Her tall, graceful form radiated power, her silver hair cascading like liquid starlight. Her violet eyes, sharp and calculating, seemed to pierce through him. Yet there was something unspoken in her gaze, an unfulfilled yearning. Welcome to the Varnek's dominion, human. Zephyr said, her tone measured. I trust your journey was comfortable. It was, Your Majesty. Orion replied with a courteous bow. Your world is extraordinary. Zephyr tilted her head, studying him intently. Humans have a peculiar way of expressing admiration. You speak with more animation than we are accustomed to. Orion chuckled lightly. We humans are known for our peculiarities, Your Majesty. Some call it charm. Zeph's lips curved slightly, a gesture so faint it was almost imperceptible. Charm, she repeated, as if testing the word. The meeting progressed with typical diplomacy, yet Zephyr found herself increasingly drawn to Orion's mannerism. He spoke of Earth with a passion that was foreign to her, describing its vibrant cultures, its triumphs, and its flaws. There was an authenticity to his words that she found both puzzling and captivating. As their discussion concluded, Zephyr made an unexpected request. Tell me, Orion Cade, what drives your people to pursue connection so fervently? Is it not a distraction from progress? Orion paused, choosing his words carefully. Connection, Your Majesty, is the essence of progress. It's what pushes us to create, to protect, to thrive. Without it, life feels hollow. The word hung in the air, resonating deeply within Zephyr. Hollow, she murmured almost to herself. For the first time in her life, the queen felt as if someone had put into words the emptiness she had long tried to ignore. As Orion departed the throne room, Zephyr watched him go, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What was it about this human that stirred something within her? Could he, with his peculiar charm and unshakable passion, hold the answers to the questions she had buried for so long? Zephyr didn't know, but she was determined to find out. As the massive doors of the throne room closed behind Orion, Zephyr reclined in her seat. Her thoughts tangled, his words lingered in her mind like a haunting melody. Connection is the essence of progress. Without it, life feels hollow. She replayed the phrase over and over, trying to dissect its meaning. Zephyr rose from her throne, her flowing silver robes catching the ambient light of the chamber. She dismissed her guards with a wave, retreating to the solitude of her private study. The chamber was a stark contrast to the grandeur of the palace, a quiet space filled with intricate devices, glowing panels and shelves. Holding ancient texts from across the galaxy, she activated the archive. Again, this time searching specifically for human depictions of connection. The holographic projections shifted to display scenes of humans in various forms of intimacy, a mother cradling her child, lovers sharing a kiss under a setting sun, and friends laughing over shared stories. Each image seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't name, but felt deeply drawn to her eyes. Lingered on a particular image, a human couple entwined, their faces glowing with joy. Zeph's hand hovered over the projection, her fingers brushing through the light. How can something so simple hold so much power? She whispered to herself. Meanwhile, Orion was escorted to his quarters in the guest wing of the palace. The room was opulent yet cold, its sleek design lacking the warmth he associated with comfort. He ran a hand through his dark hair, letting out a slow breath. The queen was unlike any diplomat or leader he had ever encountered. Her presence was commanding, her gaze sharp, yet there was an underlying vulnerability she seemed desperate to conceal. He set his bag on a polished table and opened a small holographic device projecting a person log. Speaking to it felt like a grounding ritual after the tension of the day. Mission log day 1 on Vex. He began, his voice low and steady. Queen Zephyr is an enigma. Her people are fascinatingly advanced but emotionally detached. It's like speaking to a machine with a soul trapped inside, but her eyes, they say more than she intends. I think she's searching for something, though she might not even know what it is. He paused, aiming at the sleek window that overlooked the sprawling city below. This mission is critical, but I have a feeling it's about more than just diplomacy. There's something here, a crack in the facade. If I can find it, I might understand what makes the Viennas tick. He ended the log and leaned back against the chair, staring at the ceiling. Little did he know his presence had already begun to stir something dormant in the queen. In her private study, Zephyr continued to immerse herself in the forbidden arc. If one file caught her attention, a series of human writings on the concept of climax. Unlike the sterile language of new records, the human descriptions were vivid, almost poetic. They spoke of it as a moment of transcendence, a merging of body and spirit that defied logic. Her brow furrowed as she read. Could this truly exist? She wondered. For centuries, the Vexans had dismissed such notions as primitive delusions, yet the intensity with which humans described it made her question if there was something her people had overlooked. The sound of soft footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Ulf, her most trusted advisor, stood at the threshold. The older woman's expression was calm but curious. Your Majesty, is everything well? Zephyr deactivated the archive, her expression guarded. Yes, Ulf. Why do you ask? I couldn't help but notice your interest in the human delegate. Ulf said carefully. He is unlike the others we've encountered. Zephyr turned away, her gaze fixed on the faint glow of the city lights beyond the window. He intrigues me, she admitted. There is a passion in his words, a depth of feeling I cannot comprehend. It is as if he knows something we do not. Ulf hesitated. Your Majesty, be cautious. The humans are persuasive by nature. Their emotionality is both their strength and their weakness. Zephyr nodded, but said nothing. As Linf left the room, the queen's thoughts returned to Orion. His words had stirred a longing she could no longer ignore. Later that evening, Zephyr called for a private dinner with Orion. The setting was intimate, a stark contrast to the formality of their earlier meeting. The dining chamber was adorned with soft lights casting a warm glow over the polished surface of the table. A selection of dishes, both human and Varan, was arranged meticulously before them. Orion entered, his curiosity evident. I "Didn't expect this, Your Majesty," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Am I being interrogated over dinner?" Zeph's lips curved slightly, a faint echo of a smile. "Consider it an opportunity to educate me or encade your peoples. Peculiarities fascinate me." As they began their meal, the conversation flowed. Naturally, Zephyra asked probing questions about human emotions, love, and intimacy. Her curiosity, uncharacteristically unguarded, Orion answered with the honesty and charm that came so effortlessly to him, weaving tales of Earth that painted vivid pictures in her mind. At one point she asked, "Do all humans experience this connection you speak of, this so-called climax?" Orion paused, meeting her gaze. "Not all, Your Majesty. It's not guaranteed or easily found. It takes trust, vulnerability, and a shared desire to reach that kind of connection. It's rare, but when it happens, it's unforgettable." Zeph's expression softened, her violet eyes reflecting a flicker of something new, unforgettable. She repeated the word, rolling off her tongue like a foreign delicacy for the first time in her life. Zephyra felt the stirrings of hope that perhaps the myths she had dismissed held a fragment of truth, and that this human might be the key to unlocking it. As the evening unfolded, the conversation between Zephyra and Orion began to take on a rhythm, almost like a dance. The human's easy charm and openness were disarming, but beneath his polite demeanor, Zephyra sensed a quiet strength. It intrigued her, even unsettled her. The queen was not accustomed to being caught off guard, yet here she was leaning forward, hanging on to his every word. "You make it sound as if connection is a universal truth," Zephyra said, her voice thoughtful, "something inherent to all species." Orion took a sip from his glass, the alien liquid slightly sweet and warm against his palate. He set it down deliberately before answering, "I can't speak for the universe, but for humans it's everything. It drives us, inspires us, and sometimes destroys us. It's messy, but that's what makes it real." Zephyra tilted her head, her silver hair shimmering in the soft light. "Messy," she repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. His value, order, and precision. To embrace something chaotic would be seen as weakness or strength. Orion countered gently, "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let yourself feel." The queen's violet eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment the room seemed to shrink around them. Zeph felt an unfamiliar warmth rising within her, a sensation that both intrigued and unsettled her. She straightened, breaking the gaze. "You speak as though feelings are a weapon." "They can be," Orion admitted, leaning back in his chair. "But they also a shield. They protect us, remind us we're alive." The queen fell silent, her gaze drifting to the flickering light of a nearby candle-like device. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but something about his words resonated deep within her. For years, she had felt as though she were merely existing, fulfilling her duties as queen without truly living. Was this what she had been missing? The next morning, Zephyr summoned Linth to her private chamber. The advisor entered, her expression calm but observant. "You requested my presence." "Your Majesty." "Yes," Zephyr said, her tone sharper than she intended. She softened it quickly, her hands clasped behind her back. "I need access to the full archives on Earth, all classified files." Luma's brow furrowed. "Your Majesty, the Council has restricted those records. They believe such information could influence our culture in undesirable ways." Zeph turned, her gaze piercing. "And as queen, I have the authority to override such restrictions. Or have they forgotten?" Wolf hesitated, but eventually bowed. "As you wish, Your Majesty. The files will be delivered to your study." As the advisor left, Zephyra felt a twinge of unease. She knew she was treading dangerous ground, but her curiosity burned too fiercely to ignore. She needed to understand humans, not just their culture, but the essence of what made them so different, and perhaps through that understanding she could find the answers to the questions that had haunted her for so long. Later that day, Orion found himself wandering the palace gardens, a sprawling expanse of bioluminescent flora and cascading waterfalls. The air was crisp, carrying a faint, otherworldly fragrance that reminded him of lilacs on Earth. He paused by a glowing tree, its branches arching gracefully over a reflective pool. "You seem lost in thought," a familiar voice said behind him. Orion turned to see Zephyr approaching, her silver robes flowing around her like liquid light. She moved with the grace of someone who had been trained to command, yet there was a softness in her expression he hadn't seen before. Your Majesty, he greeted with a slight bow. I didn't expect to see you here. This is one of the few places where I can think, she admitted, her gaze sweeping over the garden. Tell me, Orion, Cade, do humans find solace in nature, as we do? More than you might think, Orion said, his tone warm. There's something about being surrounded by life, even in its simplest forms, that reminds us of our place in the universe. Zeph nodded, her eyes reflecting the glowing light of the trees. And yet you speak of life as if it's tied to emotion. How can something so intangible shape existence? Orion smiled faintly. It's not just tied to life. It is life without emotion, without connection. What's the point of any of this? He gestured to the garden around them. The palace beyond all the advancements, the power, it's empty without meaning. The queen's gaze dropped to the reflective pool, her expression unreadable meaning. She murmured, I wonder if my people have forgotten what that is. Orion watched her carefully, sensing the vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. Maybe you haven't forgotten, he said gently. Maybe you're just looking in the wrong places. Zephyr looked up at him, and for the first time her guarded mask seemed to crack. There was something raw and unspoken in her eyes, something she wasn't ready to admit even to herself. Perhaps, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper as they parted ways. Zephyr returned to her study, her mind racing. Orion's words had planted a seed, one that refused to be ignored. She activated the newly delivered archives, diving into the forbidden knowledge with a fervor she hadn't felt in years. The images, the stories, the emotions, they overwhelmed her, yet she couldn't stop. By the time she finally pulled away from the console, hours had passed. She sat back, her hands trembling slightly. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, was there more to existence than logic and duty? Could she, a queen bound by tradition, dare to seek it out? And in the quiet of her chamber, with only the hum of the archive to keep her company, Zephyr made a silent vow she would uncover the truth about humanity's so-called connection. No matter where it led her. The palace gleamed with the rising light of Vex's twin suns, casting a serene glow across the crystalline city. Below, Queen Zephyr, however, was anything but serene. She paced her private study, her mind a storm of questions and possibilities. The forbidden knowledge she had uncovered about humanity was tantalizing, and yet it defied everything she had been taught. She paused, staring at a particular entry in the archive, Human Connection, the role of trust and vulnerability. It described how humans achieved emotional intimacy through openness, a concept alien to the Varian way of life. The words resonated with her, leaving her uneasy. She needed answers, and she knew exactly who could provide them. Orion Cade was enjoying the gardens again, taking a moment to himself before his next round of diplomatic meetings. The very palace, while stunning, felt eerily quiet, as if emotion had been drained from its very walls. He was lost in thought, admiring the way the glowing flowers seemed to sway without wind, when Zeph's voice broke the silence. Orion Cade, she called, her tone sharp yet not unkind. He turned, offering her a polite smile. Your Majesty, to what do I owe this honor? Zeppa stepped closer, her regal bearing as commanding as ever, though her expression betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Walk with me, she said, gesturing down a pathway lined with bioluminescent vines. Orion complied, falling into step beside her. They walked in silence for a time, the soft hum of the flora their only companion. Finally, Zeph spoke. Tell me about trust, she said, her voice measured. Your archives suggest it is integral to human connection, yet it seems illogical to willingly place oneself in a vulnerable position is to invite potential harm. Orion glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. Trust isn't about logic, Your Majesty, it's about faith that the person you trust won't use your vulnerability against you. It's what builds bonds between friends, lovers, even nations. Zephyr frowned, her mind grappling with the concept. And what happens when that faith is betrayed? Orion hesitated, his gaze distant. It happens, but without trust, without taking that risk, you never truly connect with anyone. It's the foundation of everything meaningful. They reached the small clearing where a tranquil pool reflected the shimmering sky above. Zephyr stopped, her violet eyes fixed on the water. Your people are strange, Orion, she said, though there was no malice in her tone. You willingly invite chaos into your lives, yet you thrive. Orion chuckled Softly, we're far from perfect, Your Majesty, but maybe it's that imperfection that makes us human. Zephyr tilted her head, studying him. You speak with conviction. Have you experienced this trust you describe? A shadow crossed Orion's face, and for a moment he seemed older, wearier. I have, he said quietly, and I'd also lost it, but the pain of losing it doesn't outweigh the joy of having it. Not even close. The Queen watched him, her curiosity deepening. You intrigue me, Orion Cade, she admitted, perhaps more than I am comfortable with. That evening, Zephyr hosted a private dinner inviting only Orion. The setting was intimate, the table adorned with delicate viand dishes that shimmered like starlight. Orion noted the contrast between this and the formal meetings he had attended earlier. It was clear this wasn't just about diplomacy. As they ate, Zephyr continued her questions, her tone more probing now. Your people believe in something called the climax. She said, the word foreign on her tongue. It is described as the pinnacle of emotional and physical connection. Is it real or simply an exaggeration? Orion nearly choked on his drink, caught off guard by her bluntness. It's real, he said after a moment, his voice steady. But it's not just about the physical, it's about trust, vulnerability, and connection, things that can't be forced or faked. It's rare even among humans. Zephyr leaned forward slightly, her eyes intense. You speak as if it is a transcendent experience. It can be, Orion admitted, but it's not something you can understand through words alone. It has to be felt. The Queen's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. And you believe I am incapable of feeling it? Orion hesitated, sensing the weight of her question. I think anyone can feel it, Your Majesty, but only if they're willing to let go of their defenses and allow themselves to be vulnerable. Zephyr sat back, her mind racing. For so long she had lived behind a fortress of logic and duty. The idea of lowering that guard, even slightly, was both terrifying and strangely alluring. In the days that followed, Zephyr found herself seeking Orion's company more often. They walked the palace grounds, exchanged stories, and debated philosophy and culture. With each conversation, the Queen felt her walls beginning to crack, her carefully constructed persona unraveling. One evening, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the city, Zephyr turned to Orion. You've challenged everything I thought I knew, she said quietly. You've made me question my people, my beliefs, even myself. I do not know whether to thank you or resent you for it. Orion smiled, his green eyes warm. I'll take that as a compliment, Your Majesty. For the first time in her life, Zephyr felt something unfamiliar yet undeniable. Hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the myths her people had dismissed held a kernel of truth, and with Orion Cade by her side, she was determined to uncover it. The air in the palace grew heavier as the days went on, a silent tension underlying the growing rapport between Queen Zephyr and Orion Cade. The Farnan Council began to take notice, their whispers trailing behind the Queen as she walked the halls. Zephyr, however, paid them no mind. For the first time in her life, she felt something, an undefinable force, drawing her toward the human diplomat. It was during one of their evening walks that the barrier between them began to crack. The garden, illuminated by glowing flora and a cascading waterfall, was a refuge for Zephyr, a place where she allowed herself to think freely. Orion accompanied her, his steady presence a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. As they strolled along the winding paths, Orion noticed the subtle tension in Zeph's posture. Something on your mind, Your Majesty? He asked gently. She paused, her gaze fixed on the shimmering water. Do you ever doubt yourself, Orion Cade? Do you ever wonder if the path you've chosen is the right one? Orion considered her question, his expression thoughtful. All the time, he admitted, but I've learned that doubt isn't a weakness. It's a reminder that we're human, that we care about the choices we make. Zeph turned to him, her violet eyes searching his face. I envy that about your people, she said quietly. You embrace your imperfections, your uncertainties. My people see such things as flaws, weaknesses to be eradicated. Maybe that's where your people have it wrong, Orion said, his voice steady but kind. Imperfection isn't a flaw, it's what makes us unique, it's what makes us alive. The Queen's gaze lingered on him, and for a moment the air between them seemed to hum with unspoken emotion. But before either of them could speak, the distant sound of commotion shattered the moment. The palace guards were in chaos when they returned. Zeph's chief advisor, Ulf, rushed to meet her, her expression "Grim Your Majesty, there has been an attempt on your life." Zeph's eyes narrowed. "An attempt by whom we are still investigating," Ulth said, her voice tight. "The ascent was apprehended, but we suspect a faction within the council may be involved." Orion stepped forward, his posture protective. "Is she safe here?" he asked, his tone sharp. Linth glanced at him, her expression wary. "For now, yes. But I suggest heightened security measures." Zephyr raised a hand, silencing them both. "Enough. I will not cower in my own palace. Orion K, you will accompany me to the council chamber tomorrow. If there are traitors among us, I intend to confront them directly." Orion hesitated, but the resolve in her eyes left no room for argument. "As you wish, Your Majesty." The following day, the council chamber was a hive of tension. Z stood at the head of the room, her regal presence commanding attention. Orion stood beside her, his sharp green eyes scanning the room for any signs of treachery. "You have all sworn loyalty to the Varnic Dominion," Zephyr said, her voice cold and precise. "Yet someone among you has sought to betray me. I will not tolerate such treachery." The council members exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Saphira's gaze swept over them, her expression unyielding. "If you have nothing to say, then I will find the truth myself. And when I do, there will be consequences." Orion watched her with quiet admiration. Despite the danger, she stood firm, her authority unwavering. It was a stark reminder of the strength that had drawn him to her in the first place. That evening, as the palace settled into an uneasy calm, Zephyr found herself once again in the garden with Orion. The tension of the day weighed heavily on her, and for the first time she allowed herself to show it. "I cannot trust them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The very people who are supposed to protect me may be the ones plotting against me." Orion placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. "You're stronger than they think, Zephyr, and you're not alone." Her gaze met his, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes she couldn't quite name, something that made her feel both vulnerable and safe. She took a deep breath, the warmth of his hand grounding her. "Thank you, Orion Cage," she said softly, "for reminding me of who I am." As the days passed, their bond grew stronger. Orion introduced Zephyr to human customs, sharing stories of Earth's history, art, and music. One evening, he brought a small device that played a haunting melody, the notes filling the room with a warmth that seemed to reach into Zeph's very soul. "What is this?" she asked, her voice tinged with wonder. "It's a song," Orion said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Music has a way of expressing what words can't. It's a connection, a language everyone can understand." Zeph closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. For the first time, she felt something stir deep within her, a yearning she couldn't ignore. When the song ended, she opened her eyes, her gaze meeting. "Or you are unlike anyone I have ever known," she said softly. "You make me question everything I thought I knew." Orion reached for her hand, his touch tentative but steady. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing, Your Majesty. Sometimes the only way to find the truth is to question everything." Zephyr hesitated for only a moment before allowing her fingers to intertwine with his. It was a small gesture, but to her it felt monumental, a crack in the walls she had built around herself. And in that moment, for the first time in her life, Queen Zephyr began to believe that there might be more to existence than logic and duty. There might be connection, there might be trust. And perhaps, just perhaps, there might be something even more profound waiting to be discovered. The palace corridors seemed colder, quieter, as if the walls themselves could sense the brewing conflict within. Zeph's days were consumed with council meetings, investigating the attempt on her life, and maintaining her unshakable facade. Yet beneath the surface, her thoughts were increasingly preoccupied with one person, Orion Cater. Interactions with a human diplomat had ignited something within her that she couldn't define. It was more than curiosity, more than fascination. It was a pull, an undeniable gravitational force. But the weight of her responsibilities as queen loomed large, and the whispers of her council grew louder. Zeph sat in her private chamber, poring over intelligence reports on the suspected traitors. Ulth entered, her expression as sharp and precise as ever. "Your Majesty," Ulth began, bowing slightly. "The council grows restless. They've noticed your increased interactions with the humans." Zeph's violet eyes snapped up, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "And what of it?" Orion Cade is here as an emissary. It is my duty to engage with him, of course, your majesty, Lyneth said carefully, but they see it as something more. They fear his influence may cloud your judgments. Zephyr leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Do you believe my judgment is clouded, Lyneth? The advisor hesitated, then shook her head. No, but I urge caution. The council is protective of our traditions. They will not tolerate anything that appears to compromise your authority. Zephyr nodded, dismissing Lyneth with a wave of her hand. As the door closed behind her advisor, the queen let out a slow breath. She was walking a fine line, and she knew it, but for the first time in her life, she wondered if the cost of maintaining that line was worth it. Orion found himself increasingly drawn to Zephyr, her composure, intelligence, and the rare glimpses of vulnerability she allowed him to see made her unlike anyone he had ever met yet. He was acutely aware of the tension his presence was causing among the connections. One evening, as he stood on a balcony overlooking the glowing cityscape, Zephyr appeared beside him. Her silver robes shimmered under the light of the twin moons, and for a moment Orion was struck by her ethereal beauty. Do you find our world so fascinating? She asked, her tone light, but tinged with curiosity. I do, Orion replied honestly, but what fascinates me most isn't the technology or the architecture, it's you, your majesty. Zephyr turned to him, her expression unreadable. You have a way of speaking that is disarming, Orion Cade. It is both a strength and a danger, dangerous only if the truth is something to fear, he said, holding her gaze. Her eyes softened, and for a moment she allowed herself to drop her guard. You challenge me in ways I never expected, she admitted. You make me question everything I have been taught. Maybe that's not a bad thing, Orion said gently. Sometimes questioning is the first step to understanding. Their connection deepened over the following days. Orion continued to share stories of Earth, of its beauty, its flaws, and the connections that defined humanity. Zephyr, in turn, opened up about the pressures of her role as queen and the loneliness that came with it. One evening as they walked through the gardens, Orion reached for her hand. Zephyr froze, her mind racing. No one had ever dared to touch her so casually, yet there was no offense in his gesture, only warmth and reassurance. Trust me, he said softly, his green eyes searching hers. For a moment Zephyr hesitated, then slowly she allowed her hand to remain in his. The sensation was unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. You are bold, Oricade, she said, her voice quiet but steady and reckless. Maybe, he replied with a small smile, but sometimes recklessness is worth it. The whispers within the palace grew louder. Members of the council began to question Zeph's judgment more openly. Their distrust of Orion thinly veiled. A secret meeting was called, and Ulf, the loyal to Zephyr, attended out of duty. The queen is distracted, one council member said. This human has her under his spell. We cannot allow his influence to destabilize our leadership. Another added, if she continues down this path, we must act. Ulf remained silent, her loyalty to Zephyr battling with her duty to the council. She left the meeting with a heavy heart, knowing that the queen's growing connection with Orion was putting her in a precarious position. Zephyr was not oblivious to the growing unrest. She confronted Ulf in the privacy of her study. They plot against me, she said bluntly. Do not deny it. Ulf hesitated, then nodded. They are concerned, your majesty. They see your relationship with a human as a threat. Zeph's eyes narrow. And what do you see? Ulf, the advisor, met her gaze. I see a queen who is discovering something new about herself, but I fear that in doing so you may be putting yourself at risk. Zeph's expression softened, and for the first time she allowed herself to confide in Ulf. He makes me feel alive, she admitted, as if I have been living in a dream, and he is the first light of waking loneliness. Expression was conflicted, but she nodded, then tread carefully, your majesty, for light is beautiful as it is can also blind. That night Zephyr found Orion in the gardens, as she often did. She approached him quietly, her expression troubled. They are turning against me, she said without preamble. Orion turned to face her, concern etched on his face. Because of me, because I am changing, she corrected, and change frightens them. Orion stepped closer, his voice steady. What do you want? Zephyr, not as a queen, but as you. Her breath caught at the question. No one had ever asked her that before. She looked at him, her walls crumbling. I don't know, she admitted, but I think I want to find out. Orion reached out his hand, brushing against hers. Then, let me help you. For the first time, Zephyr allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face this journey alone. The moonlight bathed the palace gardens in an ethereal glow, casting soft shadows across the pathways where Queen Zephyr and Orion Cade often met tonight. The air was thick with unspoken emotions. The tension between them had grown undeniable, their exchanges charged with something deeper than diplomacy. Zephyr had spent the day locked in council meetings, her authority questioned more openly than ever. The whispers of rebellion were no longer just whispers, and the weight of her crown felt heavier than it ever had yet. As she stepped into the garden and saw Orion waiting for her by the glowing pool, a small flicker of warmth pierced the cold void within her. You look troubled, Orion said, his voice gentle as she approached. She sighed, her silver robes flowing like liquid light behind her. The council grows bolder there. Distrust of you fuels their discontent. And of you, Orion asked, his green eyes searching hers. They question my ability to lead, she admitted, her tone laced with frustration. They see my willingness to entertain new ideas as a weakness. Orion took a step closer, his voice steady. Change is never easy, especially for those who fear it. But strength isn't about clinging to what's familiar, it's about embracing what's right, even when it's difficult. Zeph studied him for a long moment, his words stirring something deep within her. You speak as if you know this struggle intimately. I do, he said simply, but it's not my story that matters right now, it's yours. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they walked through the garden, the tension between them easing into a comfortable silence. Orion shared stories of Earth's natural wonders, from the vastness of the oceans to the quiet beauty of a snowfall. Zephyr listened intently, her curiosity about his world growing with every word. You speak of your home with such passion, she said, a hint of wonder in her voice. It is as though you carry it with you even here. In a way, I do, Orion said with a small smile. Home isn't just a place. It's the people, the memories, the connections, something you carry in your heart. Zeph's gaze softened, her walls crumbling further. I envy that, she admitted. I have always had power, authority, but I have never felt connected. Orion stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression earnest. You can, Zephyr. Connection isn't something you're born with, it's something you choose to create. Her breath hitched at his words, and for the first time she allowed herself to entertain the possibility that he might be right. The pivotal moment came later. That evening, Zephyr had invited Orion to her private chambers, a gesture that broke every unspoken rule of decorum. The room was elegant but understated, a reflection of the Queen's disciplined nature. A soft ambient light filled the space, casting a warm glow over the intricate designs etched into the walls. Orion stood by the window, gazing out at the cityscape. Your world is breathtaking, he said softly, but it feels distant, almost as if it's trying to keep itself from being truly seen. Zephyr approached him, her heart pounding in a way she couldn't explain. Perhaps that is true of my people as well, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We have built walls so high that even we cannot see beyond them. Orion turned to her, his gaze intense but kind. What do you see when you look beyond them? I see you, she admitted, the words escaping her before she could stop them. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with an unspoken understanding. Slowly, Orion reached out and took her hand in his. Then let me show you what connection feels like. Zeph's pulse quickened, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed herself to be vulnerable, to let the walls she had built crumble completely. Orion's touch was warm, grounding her in a way she had never experienced. As he lifted her hand to his lips, the softest of kisses sent a shiver down her spine. It was unlike anything she had ever felt, electric and tender, a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. That night, their bond deepened in ways neither of them had anticipated. Orion didn't just speak of connection, he showed her what it meant. He spoke of trust, vulnerability, and the beauty of opening oneself to another. For Zephyr, it was a revelation, a moment of awakening that changed everything. The experience was not just physical, it was emotional, a merging of two souls that transcended the boundaries of their worlds. Zephyr felt a warmth she had never known, a light that seemed to fill the void she had carried for so long. When the moment passed, they sat together in silence, The connection between them unbreakable. Zephyr rested her head against Orion's shoulder, her violet eyes reflecting a new-found sense of peace. "You have shown me something I thought was a myth," she said softly. "Something I never believed I could experience." Orion smiled, his arm draped around her. "And you've shown me that even the strongest walls can be broken if you're willing to let them." Zephyr close her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. For the first time in her life, she felt whole, and she knew without a doubt that her connection with Orion was more than just a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. The palace corridors were tense and hushed, a silence that seemed to vibrate with the unspoken truths lurking beneath the surface. Zephyr had spent the last few days in a state of unprecedented vulnerability. Her connection with Orion had awakened something within her, a sense of clarity and purpose she had never known yet. As she allowed herself to feel, the world around her seemed to grow colder. More dangerous whispers of rebellion had turned into outright murmurs, and the council's discontent was no longer veiled. Zephyr knew she was treading on dangerous ground, but for the first time she felt she had something worth fighting for, something worth risking at all. Zeph's closest advisor, Ulf, entered her private chamber. Her expression grave. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice low, "there are rumors circulating among the council. They believe your connection with Orion Cade is compromising your ability to lead." Zephyr looked up from the reports she had been reviewing, her violet eyes sharp. "What exactly are they saying?" "They claim that you are distracted," Ulf said carefully, "that your emotions have clouded your judgment. Some even suggest that Orion himself may be manipulating you to serve human interests." Zeph's jaw tightened, a surge of anger rising within her. "They accuse him of treachery without evidence. He has done nothing but offer his assistance and wisdom." Ulf hesitated, then stepped closer. "Your Majesty, I fear their distrust may escalate. There are those among the council who would seek to remove him by force, if necessary." Zephyr stood abruptly, her presence commanding. "They will not touch him," she said firmly. "He is under my protection." Linth bowed her head. "As you wish, Your Majesty, but I urge caution. The council's loyalty to you is not as steadfast as it once was." That evening, as the twin moons bathed the palace in silver light, Zephyr sought out Orion. She found him in the gardens, seated by the glowing pool where they often met. His face was calm, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. "They're turning against you because of me," Orion said softly as she approached Arun. "They?" Zephyr hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, they fear what they do not understand." Orion looked up at her, his green eyes filled with concern. "Then maybe it's better if I leave, if my presence puts you in danger." "No," Zephyr interrupted, her voice firm. She stepped closer, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I will not allow them to dictate my choices. You have shown me a truth they refuse to see." "And what truth is that?" Orion asked, his voice quiet. "That there is more to existence than duty and logic," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've made me feel alive, Orion. For the first time, I understand what it means to truly live." Orion rose to his feet, his expression softening. "And what happens when they try to stop us? Because they will, Zephyr. Then I will face them," she said resolutely. "I am their queen, and they will not control me." The confrontation came sooner than either of them had anticipated. The next day, during a council meeting, one of the senior members, Valeric, stood and addressed the room with thinly veiled hostility. "Your Majesty," Vale began, his tone respectful but sharp, "we have tolerated the presence of the human emissary out of respect for your wishes, but his influence has become a matter of concern." Zeph's expression remained calm, but her eyes burned with intensity. "What exactly concerns you, Vale?" "His proximity to you," Valeric said bluntly. "It is inappropriate for a queen to form such close ties with an outsider. It compromises your judgment and endangers the stability of our dominion." The room fell silent, all eyes on Zephyr. She stood, her voice ringing with authority. "You question my judgment, yet you have no evidence to support your claims. Orion Cade has done nothing but offer his assistance and insight. If you see that as a threat, perhaps the issue lies with you, not him." Valar's eyes narrowed. "Your Majesty, I speak only out of loyalty to our people. We cannot afford to let emotion cloud our decisions." "Then let me make this clear," Zephyra said, her voice cold. "My decisions are my own, and they will not be influenced by fear or prejudice. If you cannot accept that, you are free to resign your position." The council members exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to challenge her further. Vale sat down, his expression stormy, and the meeting continued in tense silence. That night, Zephyra and Orion met in her private chambers, the weight of the day heavy on both of them. She told him about the confrontation, her voice laced with frustration. "They see vulnerability as weakness," she said, pacing the room. "They refuse to understand that strength comes from connection, not isolation." Orion watched her, his heart aching for the burden she carried. "You're fighting centuries of tradition, Zephyra. It's not going to change overnight." "I know," she said, her voice softening, "but I cannot ignore what I've learned, what you've shown me. I won't go back to the emptiness I lived with before." Orion stood and crossed the room to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to. I'm here, no matter what happens." She turned to him, her violet eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I fear what they might do to you, Orion. They see you as a threat." "Then let them," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." In that moment, their connection deepened, a bond forged not just in desire, but in trust and shared purpose. Zephyra realized that no matter what the future held, she would face it with Orion by her side. The next morning, a revelation shook the palace. Evidence surfaced that Valeric had been secretly working with a faction intent on overthrowing Zephyra. The conspiracy ran deeper than she had imagined, but it also solidified her resolve. Standing before the council, Zephyra declared her intent to root out the corruption within their ranks. "This dominion will not be ruled by fear and deceit," she said, her voice strong. "We will rise above it together." As she left the chamber, Orion met her in the corridor, a quiet strength in his eyes. "What now?" he asked. "Now," she said, taking his hand, "we rebuild, and we do it on a foundation of trust." For the first time, Zephyra felt a flicker of hope, not just for herself, but for her people. With Orion by her side, she knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The council chamber was bathed in an eerie, quiet tension. Queen Zephyra stood at the head of the room, her silver robes gleaming under the glow of Varan crystal lights. Her violet eyes scanned the assembled council members, their expressions a mixture of skepticism, unease, and reluctant respect. Beside her stood Orion Cade, steadfast and calm, a living symbol of the change she sought to bring this dominion. "Zephyra," began, her voice resonant and clear, "has thrived for centuries on logic, discipline, and order. These principles have served us well, but they are not enough to sustain us. Without connection, without trust, we are hollow." Her words hung in the air, charged with emotion. The council remains silent, their collective gaze fixed on her. "Some among you fear the changes I propose," she continued. "You see my connection with Orion Cade as a threat, but let me tell you what I see. I see an opportunity to grow, to evolve. Our strength lies not in isolation, but in unity, and unity cannot exist without understanding." Corvin, the counselor, who had emerged as the strongest voice of opposition, rose to his feet. His expression was stern, but there was no malice in his tone. "Your Majesty, you speak of unity and understanding, but how can we trust what we do not know? How can we embrace something so foreign?" Zeph's gaze softened, and she gestured toward Orion. "That is why he is here, to show us that what we do not know is not something to fear, but something to learn from. Trust begins with a single step." Corvin hesitated, then slowly nodded. "Perhaps you are right, Your Majesty, but change will not come easily. Nothing worth having ever does," Zephyra replied, her voice steady. The days that followed were a turning point for the Dominion. Zeph's bold vision began to take root, inspiring a wave of introspection among her people. She implemented reforms that encouraged open dialogue, creative expression, and collaboration with other species. Resistance remained, but it was no longer insurmountable. Orion played a key role in this transformation, serving as both an advisor and an example of what could be achieved through trust and connection. His bond with Zephyra, once a source of scandal, became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the most unlikely alliances could bear fruit. One evening, as the twin moons rose high in the sky, Zephyra and Orion stood on the balcony of her chambers. The city below them shimmered with life, its bioluminescent lights pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost celebratory. "You've done it, Orion," said his voice filled with pride. "You've changed everything." Zephyr turned to him, her expression soft but resolute. "We did it. None of this would have been possible without you." He reached for her hand, his touch warm and grounding. "What now?" She smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of determination and hope. "Now we build a future worthy of the connection we found together." Orion leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "Together," he echoed, his voice of promise. As the years passed, the Vanix Dominion flourished. Zeph's leadership ushered in an era of unprecedented progress marked by alliances with other civilizations and a cultural renaissance that celebrated both tradition and innovation. The people began to embrace the very emotions they had once dismissed, discovering a strength they never knew they possessed. Zephyr and Orion's bond became the stuff of legend, a story passed down through generations as a testament to the power of love, trust, and the courage to defy convention. Their journey had not been without struggle, but in the end, it had been worth every challenge. And as they stood side by side watching their world transform, Zephyr realized that the myths or people had long dismissed were not myths at all. They were truths waiting to be rediscovered. And with Orion, she had found a love that transcended the stars.